Everybody who grew up in 80s or lived through 90s know what Sound Blaster AWE32 is. Right after the Sound Blaster 16 is the most famous sound card for the PC, at least in the era of DOS that is. But was it actually any good or just well known? Let's find out. There are three, let's call them versions: Sound Blaster AWE32, Sound Blaster AWE32 Value and Sound Blaster 32. Each of these versions has lots of different models. In case of Sound Blaster 16, Creative Labs went mental in terms of number of different models. According to Wikipedia, there were 62 different models of the Sound Blaster 16. In case of the AWE32, they went mental a little bit less, but still released a shitload of different models. If the Wikipedia is right, then there should be 43 models out there. I've got 13 of them here, from which this one was the first one to be released. It was in 1994 and the model number is 2760. The proper AWE32 was full-featured card with some minor differences between models. It's got FM chip, of course, Wavetable ROM, Wave Blaster connector, half meg of onboard RAM, SIM expansion slots, line out, speaker out, line in, mic in, game ports, ASP chip, IDE connectors, CD in, SPDIF out and PC speaker in. The Value Edition, as the name suggests, was cheaper and lacking some features such as IDE connector or SIM slot, so it's dependent on its onboard RAM. And I know it's not technically an IDE connector, it's a CD-ROM connector. It doesn't work with a hard drive, only a CD-ROM. Moreover, some models have only proprietary connectors, which can be quite useless in the end. The Sound Blaster 32 was also a cheaper version of the AWE32. It's also lacking some features, but different ones. Unlike the Value Edition, it's got SIM slots, but it doesn't have the onboard RAM. The onboard RAM is just half meg anyway, so it's not really anything to cry about, since you can slap some memory into its slot. Moreover, the Sound Blaster 32 doesn't have a SPDIF out. What however could be missed on both cheaper versions is a Wave Blaster header. You can't connect any daughter boards to these cards. Either internal wavetable has to be enough, or a MIDI module connected through a game port. I've got these full-blown AWE32 cards, these are Sound Blaster 32s, and these are Value Editions. Later on in the review I'm gonna compare all of them in terms of sound quality, compatibility in games and features. Some models are plug and play, they have to be set up using a driver. Non-plug and play cards have to be set up using jumpers on the card, naturally. All models have some sort of FM synthesis chip, some use Yamaha's OPL and some use Creative's own CQM, which stands for Creative Quadratic Modulation. People usually trash CQM for not being faithful to Yamaha's OPL or being generally rubbish, but I don't think it's that bad, it just sounds a bit different. All proper AWE32s and Sound Blaster 32's memory can be expanded with two 30-pin memory modules, up to 32 MB, from which only 28 MB can be used because the remaining 4 MB are reserved for the ROM. You have to be careful when removing the memory from the slot, they are quite dodgy and it's not uncommon to break off one of these plastic clips. The AWE32 is also the last Creative sound card that uses ASP or CSP chips. There are signal processors used for hardware audio compression, voice recognition, etc. But since Creative wanted licensing fees for using it, it never picked up and died with the AWE32. There's literally only one game that supports it, and that's TFX. But I never registered any difference.
Missile launched! Tracking, looks like the lizard. Missile launched!
Since it was released in 1994, for testing I'm gonna use a rig from the period, which is this one. It's a Pentium 1 motherboard with Wire chipset and Pentium 166 MMX. The installation program comes on either diskette or a CD. It is a standard Creative look, just select where you want to install the driver, what programs to install, it adds some stuff to the configs and auto exec and bob's your uncle. If you want to use the card in Windows 3, just select the directory Windows is installed in and it installs the driver as well. Whatever game works in Windows, you get the sound and MIDI.
At this time, the humans were finally able to leave the core of the Earth, where they were hidden away for several centuries to survive the radiations left by the last atomic conflicts.
Now the MIDI was the main attraction of the AWE32. It's basically a Sound Blaster 16 with added wavetable. However, as the Sound Blaster 16 was very easy to work with, the AWE32 wasn't all rainbows and unicorns. You see, when a game directly supports the AWE32 with a driver, it works brilliantly, but when it doesn't, it becomes a bit problematic. The problem with the AWE32 is it doesn't work as a standard general MIDI or MPU for a one compatible device. The AWE32's wavetable uses port 620 by default, and the port 330, which is needed for general MIDI to work, is reserved for its Wave Blaster connector or MIDI/game port connector. So unless you've connected a daughter board or some external MIDI device, the port 330 doesn't do anything. You've got a couple of choices here. You can either use FM Synth, or General MIDI emulation, or MT32 emulation. And the stress is on the word emulation here. The problem, or rather problems with the emulation, lie within the TSR program called Wavetable, which makes the emulation possible. The Wavetable takes up lots of memory, so you may end up without a CD driver or something, trying to free up some memory to get some games working. Moreover, the general MIDI emulation is far more memory demanding than the MT32 emulation, for some reason. Another problem is, if the game runs in a protected mode, which is majority of them, it usually crashes or locks up the system and you have to restart the rig. Sound-wise, the emulation is not bad, it's one of the better ones to be honest. Some sound cards can produce really terrible music. Another problem is the added memory usage under DOS. If the game's got an AWE32 driver, it connects to the port 620 and uses wavetable from the onboard ROM, that's fine. However, there's no way to load a different sound bank to the memory and use it with an AWE32 game driver. You can use Wavetable to load a sound bank, but it works only for general MIDI or MT32 emulation. Moreover, there's no way to load a sound bank in a civilized way. By default, the Wavetable loads a file called synth-gm-sbk for general MIDI emulation and synth-mt-sbk for the MT32 emulation. So to load a different sound bank, you need to replace one of those default banks with a new one and then it works. Due to this workaround, it doesn't recognize SF2 sound banks under DOS. Speaking of the MT32 emulation, I've tested every model for being potentially compatible with the MPU 401 intelligent interface. I didn't expect any of the cards would be, and they weren't. The emulation doesn't work with the Sound Blaster 32 because it lacks onboard RAM. If you want it to work, you need to populate memory slot. The FM Synth works perfectly fine. Well, perfectly fine in most games. Some games have minor issues and some games don't work at all, depending on the model. I've compiled tables with the games I've tested for each model, so later in the video you can easily compare which game worked and which didn't with what model. Some say the later models have clearer output due to a newer deck, but I haven't noticed any difference really. The deck is a standard for the time, 16-bit 44kHz stereo. What I've noticed though is how much rubbish the cards are able to pick up on the way. I've got this rig right next to my main computer and it picks up all sorts of noise from there with the AWE32. Turtle Beach or Gravis cards don't do that. I've measured each model and they were all somewhat similar, some better, some worse. I've included the measurements in the table as well. All models have an amplifier, so we've got two outputs, line out and speaker out. The speaker out uses an amplifier if you need to connect your headphones or some small passive loudspeakers. As well as the Sound Blaster 16, the AWE32 comes with Mixer Set program, which allows you to control volume, bass, treble, etc. Some games need expanded memory to work. However, the plug-and-play manager that utilizes the plug-and-play cards called CTCM gets stuck during startup when I'm using EMS, so the plug-and-play cards don't work and these games don't work either. But since we are in the future, we've got Unisound Utility which utilizes the plug-and-play cards without a problem, and then these games do work. But in the past, there weren't such programs, you were dependent on the manufacturer's drivers, so technically these games don't work, even though they do nowadays. Do you know what I mean? Also, I found out that Unisound is not almighty either. Some games, such as Abuse, detect the card but the sound doesn't work. After the installation, the CTCM plug-and-play manager chooses some weird port, IRQ and DMA values, so you need to manually edit CTCM CFG file and change these values to some sensible ones. You also need to edit AutoExec and reflect these values in a Set Blaster variable. Speaking of plug and play, some models became sometimes sort of overwhelmed or whatever and played Doom, specifically Doom, like this. After the restart it was perfectly fine though. On the flip side, non-plug and play models couldn't handle some older games at all. It sounded similar but restarted an ALP, no different drivers or different settings. Some games were acting strange no matter what model I used. For instance, Alien Breed Setup always locked up my rig when I tried setting up the sound, but MIDI was okay. So the game ran without sound. However, when I set it up with a different sound card and then ran the game with the AWE32, it worked perfectly fine. This was the first AWE32 card, so it's not plug and play, but it's fully equipped. Some games didn't work properly like Budokan, Future Wars or Indiana Jones, so I marked them as not working in the table. Three cards, 3600, 3630 and 3660, had a bit of a problem with games that need EMS memory. After the sound card gets initialized, it starts producing this high-pitched frequency and keeps bugging you as long as the FM synth is in use. It's very annoying and not really listenable. These three cards have the same chip, so I blame that. This was not for testing, it's just a sort of rarity. It's made for the NEC PC98 and it wouldn't be fair to compare cards that come from two different systems. This card is a bit special, but not in a good way. It's the AWE32 value, so it lacks SIM slots. However, it also lacks an onboard RAM, so any attempt to get the emulation working is futile and you can forget about General MIDI or MT32. Same as 2760, Budokan, Future Wars and Indiana Jones don't work properly. Again the same as the 2760 and 3900, but this time even Heimdall had the same issue. This is probably the worst model, at least the worst model I've got. Lots of games didn't work at all, and some that worked perfectly fine with other models sound kinda weird. This card was sold as the AWE32 value, but the chip comes from the AWE64 and the driver detects the card as the AWE64 as well. For the sake of the review, I treat it as the AWE32, which it was sold as. Well, was the AWE32 worth the money at the time of release? Not really. In terms of sound and FM compatibility, it was on par with the Sound Blaster 16, give or take, depending on the model, but the MIDI part was a dumpster fire. General MIDI didn't work in most games unless you used some daughterboard or an external MIDI module, but for that you could buy much cheaper Sound Blaster 16 or pretty much any other sound card. Internal Wavetable didn't work in lots of games either, so you were stuck with an FM synth, which wasn't 100% either. Is it worth it nowadays? I can't say it is. If you're building a retro rig and you absolutely need the AWE32 there for whatever reason, get also some daughterboard or an external MIDI module. But again, any sound card with a Wave Blaster connector does the job more or less the same way, unless you're fond of the AWE32 Wavetable and you want to play games that directly support it. And that's about it. Whatever card you get, go play some games, have fun, and see you next time. Cheers.